Hello, everyone. So in the interests of trying to keep FINOS to some kind of schedule, which they seem to be absolutely incapable of doing, I'm just going to crack on. My name is Rob Moffatt. I'm the technical architect at FINOS. I'm very lucky to have with me Phil, Kay, and Cara, who are all from the Open Source Readiness Special Interest Group at FINOS. Guys, would you like to introduce yourselves? Do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Phil Holleran. My day job is working as the field CTO over at GitHub. Fancy title, but primarily principal technologist in the revenue organization.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is XiongPachay. I work at Goldman Sachs as the program manager for open source.
Cara, Delia. I'm the senior principal community architect for financial services within the Red Hat OSPO.
Cheers, guys. So I've got a few questions I'm going to start with. We're going to try and get through these reasonably quickly because I want to turn it over to you guys to ask some questions. I think that's where it really gets interesting. So, so first of all then, Kay, I'd like to turn to you first. So why is it important at Goldman Sachs, why is it important to get people contributing to open source?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question. So at Goldman Sachs, like any other firm, we run on a lot of open source. And, I come from a retail sales background, so I think of, each software like a product. You have to be knowledgeable about it and be able to understand its use case, be able to understand its community. And so to really be efficient and understand the business as a whole, granularly, you have to understand the community of what your business is built on. And so it's a great gateway that, open source is a concept where the users can actually go directly to the community, participate, and understand its roadmap.
Awesome. And so, Cara, you are one of the SIG leads, the Special Interest Group leads for Open Source Readiness. What do you think Open Source Readiness brings to organizations like Goldman Sachs? What is it we're trying to do there?
Well, for all financial services, I think that the Open Source Readiness SIG is really unique and that it's a great way as an intro to FINOS and all the great projects that are happening. I do want to give a quick shout out to our executive sponsor, Rydian Olds. He is our fearless leader. It's an opportunity to collaborate. We were able to create the training and certifications. It's a time to be really intentional about how we want our OSPO or our open source journeys, whether it be an OSPO training, developer engagement, how we want to work across an industry to share those best practices and really just to collaborate. I mean, it's neutral, so it's not like a selling area. I mean, I'm work in Red Hat, but I'm not talking anything about certain solutions or, same with Phil. So it's just a great entry point into the community and then also just open source in general, especially if you're coming from a non-coding background. It's a great opportunity for business leaders to have an understanding of how they can bring this back to their organizations or firms.
That's a great summary, and I think you're absolutely right. It's not about selling anything particular. It's just about interested parties coming together and trying to figure out what the best solutions to these problems are. And Phil, so from GitHub's perspective, you obviously come to the Open Source Readiness Special Interest Group meetings quite frequently. So what does that mean for GitHub?
So I'm coming more in the notion of trying to sell something as in selling the value of contributing back. There are so many packages that are out there and so many libraries on which we all depend, and whether it's you all, it's financial services, or a lot of the other more heavily regulated industries that I work with out there, whether that be like medical technology, medical care and insurance, heavy manufacturing, that depend on all of this stuff, but typically you get back to that package of one or two people maintaining it in their off time on the side. And we are all in a world of hurt if we don't support those core components that we all depend on. And if we're out here and you are all out here generating a lot of financial value out of those, it would be great just to get a few more people stepping into those active roles, contributing back, and also kind of taking a little bit of shared ownership and direction of those projects too. One of the things that I see a lot in the folks that I talk to is either a lack of a contribution policy and a lack of a way to contribute back, or something that is kind of like a Rube Goldberg or duct tape and baling wire type system that's been built to try to achieve those goals. And that works well for some of the larger firms that are here that can invest the time and the money and the effort into doing that. But if you're you're a mid-tier regional bank, or if you're a component manufacturer that makes transmission, controllers that get sold into companies, you probably don't have the budget or the wherewithal to do that. And overall, and that's where I think we could really start to grow a lot of the contribution back to a lot of these projects that could really use the help.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it a bit there. The regulation really is the key difference, isn't it, between somebody contributing within Goldman Sachs, say, and just me bashing out some code at home, right?
Exactly, and everyone seems to be a little different, but the core thing that we all kind of seem to get back to, whether I'm talking to a bank like many of you all here, or another one of those industries, is that they get that most of the time developers aren't going to be putting proprietary code into a Python library and everything else and then submitting that up. They just want a human to look at it and bless it and say, it's okay, like I've reviewed it, I've accepted that risk, it fits within policy somehow. And it would seem like it's one of those things that should be pretty easy to do, but that's the famous thing to never tell a software developer, like, oh yeah, that's easy, you could just go implement that, right?
I think given how frequently we talk about this on open source readiness, it's definitely not easy.
Exactly.
But just moving to Kay, so Kay, obviously Goldman Sachs is almost one of the leaders in open source contribution. So you've been through this maze, this difficulty. How does the workflow look like for like a developer at Goldman Sachs who wants to start contributing on some open source product that he uses?
Yeah, I think that before the contribution process actually starts, there are some prerequisites that we have for our developers. So one of it is taking the open source training, which is mandatory before any contribution is made externally. And what our training course actually does is actually start from the basis of what open source is and not making assumptions that our developers know the in and outs of it, right? So what open source is, what it means to participate in open source from a community standpoint, from a firm standpoint, and also from a developer standpoint. And then also what it means to actually be involved in open source. So not just about contribution, I think contribution is one way, but how do you get more involved to make more meaningful contributions through attending events, speaking at events, things like that. So we really want to expand the thought process on open source in general when our developers think about it. So that's number one. And then having an OSPO or having a person that's kind of the center truth for open source contribution is approvals of open source that are requested. So one of those things that we look for as a criteria is understanding, for example, if the project has a CLA, which is a contributor license agreement. So I'm the point of person for that. I'm responsible for it. And just so we make sure that we work with legal, understand those agreements in order to get our developers on board. So that's a specific use case to call out. And I think it's important to have an OSPO or someone who's dedicated to that process and the contribution workflow.
Yeah, and I think these are conversations we have all the time on open source readiness. We've documented on our body of knowledge all the stuff you've been talking about there. With like you and Cara and actually Phil as well have both all written articles covering some of these topics on the open source readiness body of knowledge. Phil, so I mean that from what Kay is saying, that's kind of the process people are going through. How does GitHub help out with that?
So full transparency, this actually used to be a different talk where I was going to come and share what we had built in order to do that. I now get to talk about what we're building, thanks to some budget reprioritizations and funding coming back after it had gone away and had its Rahmspringe elsewhere in the company. So we are currently in the process of building what I would kind of call a minimal contribution except approval workflow. The idea behind it is it's kind of a sidecar application that sits outside of core GitHub, so you could use the version that we host, or you could deploy it yourselves and host it. Our ultimate goal, though, is that we want to use as many of the primitives in GitHub as possible. So if you have a developer who wants to contribute back to a project, you could review that project using whatever process you have internally already. An administrator forks that project into your GitHub organization that you do all your open source work in, and then a developer gets a private copy of that they can start working on inside that organization, and have a pull request workflow that the approval of that pull request by whoever has to check that box and sign it off carries that commit, ferries it over to the public fork, and now you can open up a PR against the parent project. We've wanted to kind of do it this way so that we could use kind of those same familiar workflows that everyone's already kind of doing in open source with a little bit of those protections around it. Allow you to run your own additional checks and other things on that private copy if you need to, and then ultimately have that PR get exposed up to the parent project so that it's completely transparent to the maintainer. Because it's very important for us that whatever we build, we don't put any additional burdens on those project maintainers that are doing this in their spare time out of the goodness of their heart or a sense of obligation or masochism or whatever it might be. And it's important, again, just to be respectful of them in that. If you're interested in seeing it, flag me down here. I'm at the conference all day. We have a very minimal kind of bit working right now, but that's kind of where we're going with that. And then with that PR then coming from that org-owned fork, Helen, who has made one of her engineers available who's working on this with us, say hi, Helen, I'm sorry to call you out. Her team has also built a number of APIs that allow for OSPOs and organizations to report on the types of contributions that are being done. So we can funnel all those contributions through kind of like that singular workflow, and then you can start generating some information about the level of participation that you've had in the community.
That's great, and I think obviously what Phil's tool here, one of the key things you're trying to achieve there is data leakage risk and data leakage prevention, right?
Correct.
And obviously for regulated industries like finance, this is an absolutely critical piece of, it's a critical consideration when you're doing open source. And there's lots of work going on in terms of policies and controls and figuring out what a good process should look like in terms of data leakage prevention. Cara, can you talk about best practices? And so from your perspective as a SIG lead, what sort of best practices around things like data leakage prevention have you seen?
So one of the things, going back to what both Phil and Kay shared, is around your policies that you have in place. And I think as well, you want to make sure you have your stakeholders on your side, usually legal, risk, and compliance. And so the importance of having your internal stakeholders with you, and typically I'm saying this with an OSPO. The importance of an OSPO helps with being able to have eyes on your SBOMs or your software bill of materials, working with your data teams on data leakages, on any kind of vulnerabilities that or risks that you might be incurring with the consumption. One of the things too that we also recommend is kind of a sandbox area, so that you can take consume your content or whatever you're getting from the upstream, to be able to have that as almost like your holding ground, and figuring out what you need to do to potentially fix the code, push it back upstream, or to change it if you want to bring it into your commercial product. But really having those eyeballs through an OSPO is, and it's not just the eyeballs, it's the interest of the entire organization, because especially in financial services, reputational risk is so huge. And that is a risk that, I think all of us really identify with. And within our body of knowledge, we do have risks laid out, that data being one of them, risks laid out that are considerations and ways to talk to your stakeholders about mitigating those risks. And not just mitigating, but it's also to understand that there is appropriate risk to accept into your portfolio. Many times with open source, I think what is very scary for, especially around regulated industries, financial services being one of them, is that it's always just the word open. It's like, oh, we're vulnerable, we're like we're raw. But it's the OSPO's point of view and really purpose is to share the value of open source and how that does actually, affect your reputation in a positive way. I think it was actually going back to Ridian and some other folks today, and also in the State of Open Source report that both Phil and I were a part of, is how do what are the risks to not be a part of open source? So yes, there are data leakage risks there. I mean, there's any risk that would be if you have your proprietary software versus open source software.
That's a big one too. On the vendor side, you all, especially those of you with very large firms with very large market capitalizations, like to make very, very explicit demands of the software companies that you spend money to. So if you're giving GitHub money or Microsoft or Google or something, we hear your feature requests and the weight that goes behind them quite a bit. But yet we all take these dependencies on open source libraries where you are, if you're not participating in those and you're not in the community, you have zero say, zero ability to influence the direction of that project, get something built. But by actively participating, you don't even have to just go and say, hey, it'd be great if somebody could build this. You get the opportunity to just build it and make sure it gets in there as long as it meets the community's need. In some sense, that's a lot better than shaking a fist at a vendor like me or somebody else, because you can actively control it as long as you can get the business to understand that there's a lot of intrinsic value in doing so.
Yeah, that's great. I think, it's a whole different model of working, and this kind of stuff is what we discuss all the time in open source readiness, and we try and document it as well. And at this point, I'm not entirely sure how much longer we're going to have left. So I'm just going to say, obviously, if this is the kind of conversations you want to be having in your organizations, then please come along to the Open Source Readiness SIG. It's every 2 weeks, and they're on the FINOS calendar. 10 minutes, okay. So please check it out and come along and ask questions. We're going to have a mini SIG now where I'm just going to throw it open to the floor. So if you have a question for the panel, anything to do with open source or governance within open source, please have a way. Anyone got a question?
Okay, question for Phil.
Yeah.
So one of the things about regulated, specifically financial industry, that you haven't mentioned is the requirement to retain communications.
Yep.
So wondering how you're thinking of that in your solution, if you're thinking of it yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
So in terms of orders of things that we've heard customers ask for, most of the time first it's just an approval policy, yes or no, and can we at least get someone to do that? And so that's kind of the thing that we want to tackle first. I've heard you all over and a few others ask about kind of retainment of communications. Everyone seems to have a slightly different idea about what needs to be retained and for how long, and that makes it really hard as to provide out that kind of general solution. I'd love to hear, maybe after this, have a little bit more discussion about what you're maintaining and retaining and for how long, so that maybe we could look at building that in a future iteration.
And maybe it could be a future FINOS standard.
Yeah, that'd be great. Come to the SIG.
Anyone else got a question? Maybe, can I just have a quick show of hands? Who works for an open source program office or something? Okay. Can we have a question from one of the OSPO people? Can you tell us about some issue you're facing? And no one allowed to talk about it. Go for it.
I'll ask a question to Kay. So one of the things that Gab brought up this morning during the keynotes was that open source contribution can be more than code, and so your participation in the SIG being an example of that. I'm curious, as an OSPO or a program manager at Goldman, is that also something that's part of your purview, or are you really focused on the code contributions?
Yes, thanks for your question. So I always think about open source in my role kind of like in 3 pillars. So contribution, consumption, and participation. And I think as a program manager, you wear multiple hats. But I think it's very important, especially like me, I come from a very non-traditional background. I come from retail management, is saying, okay, how can I give back to the community if it's not code contributions? And it's through events like this where I can give back my knowledge. But then you also want to expand outside of kind of like the tech community too, because events like this, or other different avenues of open source actually need more than just developers, right? They need marketing people, they need, photographers, people who know how to put banners together. And so when we really stand back and think about what the open source community actually looks like, it expands farther than just developers. And I think we just need to continuously spread the word on that because we do need people from different backgrounds. But in my role, I'm very big proponent, and I think a good example of how to get engaged with the open source community. And so it's always sharing. We have an internal OSPO newsletter. So every time there's events, we send out events through our distribution list. We help our developers if they have any questions about the speaking engagement processes. So helping them with that. And I think just getting to know your developers who contribute code, getting to know them more intimately to understand their interests, and then also suggesting different avenues of how they can participate too. Sometimes when you work at a firm that, with thousands of developers globally, I think it's impactful, at least if you can find a handful, to really support them and have them as open source all-stars, to have them engage into the community and to kind of uplift them.
I have a question. How do you incentivize the developers to contribute, right? Because often the projects that usually people rely on, you wouldn't have maintainers and people quickly looking at your PRs and giving the help that is needed. And developers have less patience too, so they would do a PR, nobody is kind of looking at it, and then they disconnect, then they don't go back to the project. So what are some of the things that you all have done that's helped incentivizing as well as kind of directionally how to engage with contributions, especially for novice developers, who are just starting the journey?
I think, again, at Goldman Sachs, we just, had internal open source all-stars. So we highlight a few developers who actually give back, highlight their story, the impact, the value to the business. But then when it comes to kind of how do you integrate open source into their daily work, right? So kind of assessing what projects do they work on, what projects does their business rely on, and align them to whatever open source foundations or projects that might be in line with that. And so when it's making it make sense for them and more of a seamless process, it's also validating their contributions through visibility firm-wide to leadership and everything like that. So really understanding, coming from a developer standpoint, what's important for them, and also just acknowledging and celebrating them.
And another thing too is going back to the stakeholders, it's working with the lines of business, because one of the things you hear the most is that developers don't have time in their day to be able to contribute. And so it's working with those lines of business leaders to help them to understand the value of what they're doing in their day, and helping to reduce some of that friction. And in addition to that, it can be whatever rewards and recognition that you're leveraged through your talent management. That's a huge part. So it's working with, open source can touch any part of the company. But it's making sure that's one of the values of an OSPO, is making sure that those people are coming to the table to understand, this is what we need to support. And then also going back to have, accreditation through learning management systems or whatever kind of, internal resources you have. And I find that too, with developers, there's there's a brand cachet, and they want to be able to contribute. Communities have their own awards as well, and which we'll see at the end of the day. Hopefully, you all can attend. But being able to be a valued part of a community, I think that's really the value. Especially coming out of COVID, people want to know what they're touching is affecting other people.
I wanted to hit on something an example that you gave. Has maybe show of hands, who here has had a PR or issue ignored in an open source project for quite a while? It's a terrible experience, right? And it can be the type of thing that is disheartening and causes people to not engage and choose not to try to go to another project. Part of that is just education about how open source projects work. Remember that there are people like you who are probably doing this on the side time. But then also, I think that also speaks to project qualification. You've all probably got different qualification criteria that you're looking at about which ones are we going to contribute back to, which ones are we going to take in as dependencies. And I think one of those is looking back to level of activity. Has it had a fair amount of PRs merged in the past few months? How long are things staying open? Is the community engaged? If you see a whole lot of things that have been open for 2 to 3 years, it's probably not a great candidate to try to start contributing back to, at least as a first pass. Unless it's like the only library out there that does what it does, the standard little XKCD Lego piece holding it up. But and then as ideally then introducing developers into open source participation into those places where they're more likely to have success, more likely to get engagement is a good way to build that up and encourage those repeat contributions.
And just actually tagging onto that, though, and with Project Health, that's going to help with going back to data leakage. That's going to go back to your security. You want to make sure that you're a part of a secure, vibrant community because you're going to have more eyes looking at that code. Sorry, go ahead.
Brian.
Yeah, I had a question, just the connection to projects. Like how do you, I'm curious how you approach conversations with maintainers. Do you work with projects outside foundations? Like what's that story?
Oh, is that a question for me? Or
Anybody who wants to take it.
Go on, Kay.
I think that's probably best handled.
oh yeah, can you repeat your question again?
I was curious about, because so you, Goldman Sachs have a internal readiness for you can contribute, but is there the same thing for the projects you can contribute to?
So like projects that we can contribute to. So there's a whole approval process for that. It's a manual process. So every time someone requests to contribute to a project, I actually take a look at the project and like Phil said, we assess the health, we assess, our pull requests being merged in, issues being, answered. We look at obviously the license, the contribution file, and making sure everything is kind of in alignment to the business needs before we actually approve it.
Yes, at the back there.
I have a question for Kay also. As the number of developers who are interested in open sourcing increases and you get more PRs and more code that you want to open source, what are some of the guardrails you have to make sure that no confidential information is accidentally submitted to one of these to an open source?
Yeah, so we work on pretty much a standard industry workflow where we do have a private repo. All code contributions are made there for review prior to it being pushed out into the actual open source project. And so we make sure that the people that are reviewing the code is familiar with that project as well.
Go on, Bella.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let me
Bill.
actually add one thing.
Yeah, go right.
So one of the things to consider as well
You want that mic?
Do you want to stand up and tell us?
One of the things to
This is a
consider as
repeat
well
last year,
is the benefit of actually allowing developers to contribute from outside of the company network, right? Because then you actually don't have access to as much confidential information. And although it sometimes makes people feel concerned, oh no, everything must be under my control. But if you have the right controls in place, sometimes that can be a good alternative as well.
I think it's worth also saying that, different firms have different approaches on this. There are a number of different ways you can set this stuff up and make it work. And we've done our best to try and document all these different approaches on the body of knowledge from FINOS. So check it out. I think we're actually at time now. Is that right? we're done, aren't we? So thank you to my panelists here. If we could give them all a big round of applause.